Hello, and welcome to today's presentation on observation. Before we get started, as always, please make sure that you have the PowerPoint lecture notes printed in front of you so that you can take notes as you go along. It may also be helpful for you to be in front of a computer screen that will allow you to look at the PowerPoint lecture notes online. There will be a few occasions where we're going to ask you to copy and paste some information from the PowerPoint into the web so that you can read an article or two, or you can read an abstract from that article before we go on in the PowerPoint presentation. So the video itself is really quite interactive and multimedia. And I think that if we get into that habit, then our classroom sessions will be more effective because we'll see that we can take some of these web exercises from the PowerPoint and do them in class. Okay, so we'll be talking about observation, and as a big picture idea, we can say that scientists typically know what they know through two different mechanisms. They have observation and they have experiment. Some might argue that you can also consider surveys in that realm. And so we're going to be talking about different methodologies throughout the entire semester. This particular set of lectures that we'll have during this week will be on observation. And then later on in the semester, we'll talk about survey methods, and we'll talk also about experimental methods at great length. We've seen this diagram before. This is the research cycle, and we know that we have the four quadrants that start with some kind of real-world phenomena, typically in psychology for this course. So we're going to be looking at different kinds of real-world behaviors, thoughts and feelings, as we've mentioned before, and we'll try to abstract from the real world some kind of research representation so that we get something manageable to work with, and we'll apply different methodologies. This week we're going to be emphasizing methodologies that are observational, but we'll take a little peek along the way at some experimental methods just as a little bit of a preview, and we'll see a relationship between some observational and experimental methods. These will give us some results. Later on in the course, we'll spend a lot of time talking about how we analyze the results that we obtain, and then hopefully we can take our conclusions and generalize those back to the real world. So that's our research cycle. We've seen it many times. Let's talk a little bit about the importance of our first major topic under the rubric of observation, and that's sampling. Sampling is something that we do really at a few different places in our research cycle, but it's key for observation. Let's first see if we can define it. Sampling can be defined as selecting a subset of observations from a population to estimate characteristics of the whole population. Okay? So we can think of a very simple jelly bean jar, and we don't need to eat the entire jar to get a feel for what kinds of flavors are there. We can take a sample. And as a matter of fact, taking a sample would be much more efficient. We do, though, have to make sure that we have a representative sample, and this is true also when we're looking at behaviors and we're engaged in observing behaviors. We want to make sure that we have some kind of representative sample. We can say a lot about sampling. For our purposes today, we're going to be talking about two different varieties of sampling. One is called time sampling, and one is called situation sampling. And let's take each of those in turn. First, let's begin to define time sampling. The selection of observations that occur within one or more time intervals. Okay, so here's our little icon to remind us that we're doing time sampling. And the time intervals can be either systematic. For example, we might say that we're going to make observations in a particular setting, in a particular situation, between 2 p.m. and 3 p.m. each day. That's a 1 hour interval. Alternatively, we can have a random time sampling, so there can be any 1 hour interval in the day. So we might say, for example, that it could be 2 to 3 p.m., but we can have a random number generator pick starting times between, say, 8 in the morning and 5 in the afternoon, if that's when the folks that we want to observe are going to be operating in that time window. And we take random samples. This might get us away from the time of day effect. On the other hand, maybe you really do want to know about something that goes on in this specific interval, maybe from 2 to 3 p.m. As one particular case. Okay, so let's think if we, let's try to imagine how we can use this in a real world setting. It might be the case that you will be an educational psychologist. And as such, you might want to know, for example, how participative are the classrooms that you're in? Or that how participative are the classroom teachers? So you might go to the classroom of interest, maybe Miss McGillicuddy's class, and sit in there from 2 p.m. to 3 p.m. And you might make a note of how frequently Miss McGillicuddy is going to be calling on students to make responses. It might be that she is inclined to lecture all the time and students don't do very much interaction. On the other hand, it might be the case that she is interactive, and we can begin to make those observations by going in at this time, 2 to 3 p.m. each day, Monday through Friday for an entire week, and just making an act frequency count of how frequently the students are responding to questions that she's generating and directing at them. Okay? That would be one of the ways of doing this. We can think about that in our own classroom. We can ask, how frequently am I, as a professor, calling on students to generate responses? Okay? And we might even make 2 different categories there. How frequently do I ask students to respond? And then how frequently do students actually respond? Because there will be times when I prompt my students and there is no response from the group. So we want to make sure exactly which of those 2 behaviors we're tracking, or maybe we would track them separately, either at a systematic time or in randomized times. Okay? Of course, the interval would not have to be an hour. I'm using an hour here as an example. The interval could be as long as weeks or months or years. The interval could be as short as seconds. Okay, so that's time sampling. Let's now contrast that with situation sampling, and we'll define situation sampling this way. The selection of observations that occur in different locations or physical conditions and or social contexts. So a situation is a very important idea in psychology. We think, for example, of the issue of personality. And you might remember the big 5 factor of personality, or the 5-factor model of personality. And we can think of personality as being defined as consistent individual differences. That is, some people might be consistently relatively extroverted, others might be consistently relatively introverted. And when we say that somebody is consistently introverted or extroverted, we're talking about their behavior across situations. If we were to sample them in a variety of situations, maybe a certain level of outgoingness or a certain inclination to speak frequently and to speak loudly, we might sample a particular individual that we want to track in, say, a context where maybe they're engaged in something physical. Maybe they're on the track team. We watch how frequently they're speaking during their track running sessions. It might be the case that we check them in the classroom. They might talk more frequently in the classroom if they're extroverted. That's a different situation, right? It's a different social context. It's a different physical location. We might follow them into a grocery store, or we might be observing them in a grocery store. And we might notice that they're paired up in some way in the grocery store, and they're the ones doing all the talking. We might notice this across seasons. We might track somebody for an interval of time and recognize that they're quite talkative in the summer, they're quite talkative in the winter. It doesn't matter whether it's raining or it's sunshiny, they're talkative all the time. They might be talkative at weddings, they might be talkative out on the beach, they might be talkative even when they're sick. Okay? So if they are trans-situationally talkative, then we would have some notion that we have this consistent individual inclination to be speaking a lot, and that might be one indicator of extroversion, for example. So this would be an example of situation sampling if we were tracking something like personality. If you're a therapist and you're dealing with a young child who's having some difficulty in school, maybe he or she is acting out, and maybe they're aggressing on a regular basis. They're aggressing toward other students, and that's very inappropriate. And it's very disruptive to the other students. What we might do is try to get a feel for whether or not that particular aggression is happening in a particular context, a particular situation, or if it's happening trans-situationally. And we can look at the child on the playground, we can look at the child when he or she is with friends or family at McDonald's, in the classroom, in the cafeteria, when they're with siblings perhaps or other friends over a neighbor's house. We can look at a broad variety of situations and take a sample in those different situations of aggressive behavior. And we'd have to define what aggressive behavior looks like as we're taking those samples. But we can sample in time or sample in situations. Okay, so let's start out with 2 potential pop quiz questions. In a moment, I'll ask you to stop the video and respond to these questions. But let's get the questions out onto the table, so to speak. And here's the first potential pop quiz question. In 2 sentences, state a novel and specific example of time sampling. So I gave you a few examples a moment ago. I'd like you to generate one that's different from something that I've suggested or something that you've read in the textbook. And we'll see how specific you can get. And you should be able to articulate why this is an example of time sampling. As our second pop quiz question, we'll ask you to, in 2 sentences, state a novel and specific example of situation sampling. Okay? We want to make sure that your sample or your example differs from what I just mentioned a moment ago, and we can get some novelty there. And then during our class, we'll have the opportunity to share our responses, one person with the next, and we'll generate a broad variety of examples of time sampling and situation sampling. So please go ahead now and stop the video. Okay, welcome back. We'll now continue our second major topic as we're describing observation. We've talked a little bit about sampling. We want to move on to different kinds of observations that we might make, and we're going to contrast two types of observations, broadly speaking, and then we'll unpack each of those so we get a better idea of each of them. First, we'll begin with what we call direct observation, and this occurs when we, if you will, directly, I've put it here parenthetically so that it isn't quite so circular, but this occurs when we see, hear, touch, taste, smell, or videotape or audio tape an overt behavior as it is occurring. So we're getting it in real time. And that could be that you and I make that observation, or that somebody that we're working with makes that observation using any one of their senses, or we can have a machine as a surrogate for our senses, maybe something like a tape recorder, an audio tape recorder, or a video tape recorder. They can make observations in real time of overt behaviors. We can contrast this with what we might call indirect observation. This occurs when we infer, and the critical word here is infer. Okay, we're not sensing directly, we are inferring that a behavior occurred based on physical evidence obtained after the fact. So a key distinction here is that in this case, the behavior is being observed in real time, either by a human or one of the human's surrogates, maybe some kind of recording device. Okay? Here, we're coming onto the scene and coming across some evidence after the fact. The behavior has already transpired, but we infer that the behavior must have occurred because we have some form of physical evidence. Sometimes we have physical traces, sometimes we have archival records. These are two kinds of evidence that we might find to make an indirect observation. I realize that this might be small print for the video, so let me just unpack this a little bit. Physical traces can include different kinds of prints. Footprints. If we see footprints in the snow, we're pretty confident that somebody had to have made those footprints one way or the next. It could be that we have fingerprints. It could be that we have DNA prints. There can be lots of physical traces in the form of prints lying about the environment that we can observe, and we can infer from those what behavior might have taken place. There might be gum wrappers or food wrappers or used cigarettes or half-smoked cigarettes or fully smoked cigarette butts. There can be trash and so forth. There are things lying around after we've omitted our behaviors, after we've emitted our behaviors, and we can pick up those traces and draw some pretty good inferences about behavior. Archival records are more formal pieces of information that come from our past, but tell us about what kinds of behaviors likely transpired there. So we can look at phone records, for example, and determine that at least somebody made a call at this point in time to this particular phone number. If we have a cell phone, we might also have information about where the call originated from. Okay? And also for landlines, we have that information, where the call was originating from. Email traces, right? We know who was emailing whom, when. The same thing is true for Twitter records. We can look at the archives inside of Facebook or other social media. Such things as birth certificates. Even if you went back many, many centuries, it was the case that lots of especially the royals and the folks who are in the upper echelons of society would typically have formal records of who was born when, who was married when, who died when. Unfortunately, sometimes if you went back many decades or certainly many centuries, formal records were often not kept for much of the population. So this brings us to the idea about selective survival and selective deposit when we describe these kinds of records. If you think about selective survival, and we'll stay with the example that we had just a moment ago, it might be the case that only some records are going to survive into the future, or only some records are going to be deposited into the record at the very beginning, and if we come onto the scene later on, we're getting a perhaps misrepresentative look at what actually transpired. So we know that there must have been lots and lots of peasants or folks in the lower echelons of the socioeconomic status going back a few centuries. We might not have very much information on those folks because there was never a deposit of those records at the time of birth, or at the time of marriage, or at the time of death. You can think back even to your own high school days. A lot of things happened in high school, but only a certain amount of those activities actually make it into your yearbook. The yearbook would be something of a sampling of the activities that you had done during your senior year or during your 4 years of high school. Not all of it made it in there, so we have this selection. And sometimes it's representative, sometimes it's not quite so representative. You can imagine that sometimes people will deliberately manipulate records that they know will be historical. So there are the cases in which political individuals will want to hide very unflattering information or very incriminating kinds of information, such that when historians come by several years later, their administration might look more effective than it actually had been. A lot of us do this in our everyday lives. We might want to disregard unflattering photos of ourselves and so forth. So when we're engaged in indirect observation and we're looking at these various physical traces, either informal or formal, we need to be aware of these ideas of what might have been selectively deposited, what might have selectively survived into the future. Okay, let's now see if we can unpack these a little bit further, and we'll see if we can get different varieties of direct observation as a start. Before we do that, though, we do want to make one other critical distinction between these two broad categories of direct and indirect observation, and that is this issue of reactivity. Reactivity is going to be a relatively large problem for direct observations, which we'll see more of in just a moment, and it tends to be not a problem for indirect observations. Okay? So let's see if we can understand this important concept of reactivity. This will certainly come back to you many, many times in your career as a psychologist when you're thinking about the observational studies that you might engage in. So reactivity, a behavioral change caused by being observed. You can think of this as a reaction when being observed. And it's an important point that we should always bear in mind as psychologists. We are behavioral investigators, and behavior typically changes when people know they're being observed. Okay? So we have to ask ourselves about the research question that we might want to entertain and figure out to what extent we're okay with having somebody's behavior change simply by virtue of the fact that we're making the observation. So again, the definition is this: a behavioral change or a reaction caused by being observed. Researchers need to consider the extent to which their methods are reactive. So if I'm engaging in some kind of observation that I know is going to be altering behavior, that's a highly reactive observation that I'm making. It's a highly reactive behavioral measure that I've got. So some are highly reactive, others are not so. And let's see if we can take a look at this issue of reactivity as we explore different kinds of direct observation. The first type that we're going to talk about is called naturalistic observation. And in another video, we had talked about Jane Goodall's work in the field, where she might be just observing primates. Maybe it's orangutans, maybe it's gorillas, maybe it's chimpanzees, maybe it's bonobos, whatever the case might be. She would simply observe, sometimes from afar, how these animals were acting within their environments, how they acted with other species, how they acted with one another, and so forth, how they might have acted in isolation. She would be sometimes at a great distance from them and just observing. Presumably the animals did not know that she was watching. This would be a case of naturalistic observation. We can define it as direct observation of behavior in a setting not arranged by the researcher and without any interaction between observer and participant. So she would remain as inconspicuous as possible as she was making her observations, at least most of the time. She also went on to intervene occasionally and develop relations with some of these animals, but much of her work was done in a purely naturalistic, observational kind of way. The animals were not aware that she was watching, and she's doing this now in a setting that she didn't arrange. This is not any kind of altered or laboratory environment. The animals are truly in their natural setting. Okay? This measure is considered non-reactive, okay? Because the animals don't know that they're being watched. They're doing and they're emitting their behaviors as they normally would, and the participants have no knowledge that they're being observed. Okay? There are ways of doing this with humans, lots of different ways. Here are a couple of ways of thinking about it. You could, in principle, have a hidden camera that's recording, for example, stopping behavior near a stop sign that's at the corner at an intersection. And you might be interested, for example, in how frequently people come to a complete stop, as we are all told to do when we're learning how to drive, versus what we might call a rolling stop, when the cars slow down but they roll on through. We might want to observe how frequently people are actually coming to a complete stop. And you can imagine that we could, for example, have a hidden camera there, and we could engage then in naturalistic observation. The drivers would have no knowledge that their behavior is being monitored in any way. You can imagine, too, that we can alter that in a couple of ways. We could, for example, have you stand right at the corner and make eye contact with the drivers as they're coming to a stop. Now, that might change their behavior. That would be a more reactive measure. We could actually have a police officer standing there, either in plain clothing, so that the drivers would not know that this is a police officer, or it could be a police officer dressed in the typical uniforms that a police officer would be wearing. And you might imagine that would affect behavior even more. So this is the idea about naturalistic observation. We're trying to get a glimpse of what behavior is in its typically occurring environment without any interference from us. Researchers can do this even by simple things like sitting on a bench in a park or in a mall and watching from afar what the behaviors might be. Many times you've been watched in a mall or in a park by others who are just passing by casually. You had no idea that you were being watched. Same thing happens to me. It happens to all of us all the time. We might learn a lot about behavior by observing it in this manner. Okay, now let's move on to maybe the next level up, where we begin to introduce a type of observation that is a reactive procedure. Now here we are going to be vulnerable to the possibility that our participants are changing their behavior. We'll call this participant observation. This is a procedure in which the researcher notes behavior while directly interacting with the organism being observed. So I use organism here just to remind you that psychology is not always about human behavior. We frequently fall into the trap of talking about how humans are acting, and of course that's of interest to us, but it really could be any kind of animal, because animals do exhibit their behaviors, thoughts, and feelings. Okay, so now we have some level of interaction that goes on here. The interaction does not follow a strict script, and no variables are directly manipulated. So this is still said to be a purely observational kind of study. There is no independent variable here that would have at least two levels. We have none of that, and we're also not following a strict script. We might have a general rule about how we might want to behave, but nothing spelled out in particular. Now here's an example. Let's assume that you're an owner of a large retail corporation, maybe something like Walmart. Maybe you're a relatively high-ranking official in the Walmart chain of board of directors. Okay? And as an owner of a large retail corporation, you might act as a regular shopper to see how often your employees smile at customers. Okay? So you want to get a feel for how friendly the staff is. And what you could do is interact with the staff, but you would do so in a way where maybe they don't know that you are on the board of trustees or the board of directors, or that you're a high-ranking official in the organization. You're playing as if you're just a regular customer, but now instead of watching just from afar, you actually are moving about the store and interacting with the employees that you encounter in the various aisles, or maybe at the cash registers, and so forth. Okay? There's a really terrific article on this, and we can read the abstract, and we can read even a Wikipedia entry that I think you'll find interesting. So I hope that when the video ends in a few minutes, you'll copy and paste this into your web browser and take a look at the Rosenhan 1973 experiment, where Rosenhan feigned some different kinds of psychiatric disorders and wanted to see what kinds of reactions he would get. I think you'll find this to be really quite interesting. So this would be an example of participant observation. We do have now the problem of reactivity. This is a reactive measure, but there's no particular script, and there's no behavioral, and there's no experimental manipulation of an independent variable. Okay, we'll bump it up one more notch, okay? And now we'll go to structured observation. This can be defined as a procedure in which The researcher notes behavior while directly interacting according to a verbal and/or behavioral script. So a moment ago, if we went back to participant observation, you were interacting with your participant, but you had no particular script. You were kind of winging it, maybe with a general idea of what you wanted to find while you were making your observations. Here, we have a very strict either verbal script, we read particular words in particular orders, or we have a behavioral script. Okay? The interaction follows a strict script in this case, but no variables are directly manipulated. So we still don't have an independent variable that would have at least two different values to it, two different levels, okay? But we do have a script that we're following. So here are a couple of examples. Structured interviews in which job candidates or patients must receive the same questions in the same order for legal or clinical reasons. If I can elaborate on that just a little bit further, here at Denison University, we interview faculty on a pretty regular basis. Maybe somebody retires and we have to fill the new position, or somebody is on sabbatical, or somebody is on parental leave, so we have to bring in a new faculty member. And we have many, many people applying for the job, and we interview just 3 or 4 people, typically by telephone. And we have rules about how those interviews are supposed to be conducted. We ask, in fairness, each of the candidates a question sequence, and we always go in the same order. And we have also a script that tells us something like, if the candidate has gone on for more than 5 minutes, we might say something like, okay, thank you for your response, we need to move on to the next question. If they go on for fewer than 5 minutes, we might say, and we use the same phrase every time, is there anything else you'd like to add to that? And if they do want to add to that, we give them up to their 5-minute limit. If they don't want to add to that, then we proceed. So all of the candidates are playing by the same rules, and we are observing their responses, okay? But we're doing so in accordance with some kind of structure. So this is highly reactive because they're responding directly to what we're asking, okay? But it's very much structured, okay? I wonder if I can give you another example. As I think I've mentioned before, my sister-in-law, Lorraine, is a psychologist who works in diagnosing children who might be on the autistic spectrum. And she was training as a school psychologist a few years back at the University of New York, SUNY Albany, and she was doing a practicum. And one of her challenges on one particular day was to administer tests to, I think it was 2nd graders or so, and she was giving them portions of, I think it was an IQ test. But here's the main idea. She had to get responses to specific kinds of questions from each 2nd grader that she was interviewing. And one of the questions was trying to get at what the kids knew in general, sort of general knowledge, maybe about the world around them. And the question was geared at getting to an answer about where the sun rises and where the sun sets. So she had to use exactly this terminology. Her question was, in which direction does the sun rise? Okay? And the answers that she's to be looking for would be north, south, east, and west. But if a child doesn't answer with one of those, then she's instructed, for example, to repeat up to 3 times the question, and she has to ask the question in exactly the same way. In which direction does the sun rise? And she tells a wonderful story about a little boy who heard the question. And the question again was, in which direction does the sun rise? And the little boy said, up. Okay? Now that's not one of the 4 pre-designated responses. So a good clinician should be following clinical procedures, pause, and ask the question again, in which direction does the sun rise? And the little boy became very insistent. And he said, I said up. And he points up with his fingers. Okay? Now you can't give the child a hint at this point and say, well, is it more like north, south, east, and west? Because this is a structured observation. Okay? We don't have that latitude. We have to follow a strict script so that all children are measured according to the standardized procedure. Now we can make separate observations about what the child was actually saying, but we are going to record behaviors in accordance with our strict script. And that might be a behavioral script, it might be a verbal script, some combination of those two. Okay, now we're all the way up to a field experiment, and we'll define this way. A procedure in which the experimenter directly manipulates one or more variables in a natural setting. And when we say natural setting, we mean a setting that has not been arranged specifically for the experiment. So this could be nature, as in the woods or the oceans, so to speak, the natural environment, at the risk of being redundant. But what we can say instead is that you can also call a natural environment something like anything that's constructed by humans but not for the purpose of this particular experiment. So you can say that a school is constructed for educational purposes, and maybe we want to go into the school and watch behavior in that environment. That school was constructed for reasons other than our experiment. Okay, so we would call that a natural environment. Same thing with a shopping mall. Same thing with a hospital. You can go on and on about human-made environments that were made for reasons other than our experiment. We would call that a natural environment. Okay? These two are highly reactive, okay? Because we're looking at a response to something that we've manipulated, and we might have two levels or more of a variable. Okay? There are lots of different examples of this. We'll give you two variations on what we might call a tail length manipulation in the field. So some biologists and some psychologists are very interested in mating behavior, and we'll say maybe the mating behavior of birds. And some folks have speculated that for particular species of birds, the length of a male's tail speaks to its attractiveness to females of that same species. So what can happen is a psychologist or a biologist can actually directly manipulate, they can capture some of these animals and alter their tail length. They can add additional feathers to elongate the tail. They can snip some of the feathers in the tail so that the tail is not quite so long, or they can leave the tail as it was. And they can observe over many, many days how many kinds of mating opportunities these animals of various tail lengths might have. And there are a couple of really nice opportunities to go onto the web and see these. If you'll copy and paste this, you don't have to read the full article. You can just read the abstract from that article. The same down here. There's a very classic Nature paper that has a very brief abstract that gives us some indication about these kinds of manipulations that really do happen in the field. So the reason we call this a field experiment is because experiments have many critical factors, including the manipulation of an independent variable. And what we are directly manipulating here is tail length. And we might have two levels, a typical tail and a long tail. We might have three levels, a shortened tail, a typical tail, and a longer tail. So there are different ways of thinking about and operationalizing tail length. But if we directly manipulate those before we make the observations out in some setting that had not been created just for our purposes, we would call this a field experiment. Okay, so let's see if we can put all this together. We've talked about lots of varieties, and we'll see if we can start classifying these different kinds of observational methods. The first fork in the road that we come to is whether we're going to be doing direct observation and catching behavior online as it's occurring, okay, or indirect observation. We can think of these as generally being non-reactive. In most cases, these are more reactive. Okay? We can unpack this and talk about observation without intervention. This was the Jane Goodall variety as one example. And this is one particular kind of direct observation that is not reactive, but the others tended to be. Whenever we have some kind of intervention, then we do have the problem of reactivity. Behavior really is changing because of how we are acting toward our participant. Right? So we have participant observation. You might remember that this is the case where we are interacting, but we don't have a behavioral script. We don't have a verbal script. We might just have a general idea of how we want to act without following any strict set of rules. We can contrast that with structured observation, where it might be the exact words are spelled out, or that there's some kind of if-then relationship or a flow chart that would tell us to act in a certain way in advance if we observe this or if we observe that. So the distinction between these two is that this has a strict script and this one doesn't. What these two have in common is that neither one of them has a directly manipulated variable. That's an independent variable that would have to have at least two levels, and that's where the field experiment comes in, where we are directly manipulating some variable. In our earlier example, we had tail length, and this was manipulated out in the field. Over here, for indirect observation, we talked about the importance of having physical traces and archival records to infer behavior that had occurred after the fact. We're now drawing that inference after the fact, and we talked about the problems and challenges of selective deposit or selective survival. Sometimes people are getting rid of unflattering pictures or incriminating evidence. Not everything is captured when we're creating our yearbooks and so forth. So here is one way of thinking about all of these different observational methods and how they might relate one to the next. Okay? I'd like to take another approach to looking at these observational methods, and that's shown here. For any given study, whether it's an observational study, but even if it's experimental, we can think about this scheme for helping us to classify different kinds of research approaches. And we'll be coming back to this throughout the semester. Here's a three-dimensional analysis of any kind of research that we might encounter, research that we might do, or research that we might be reading about. Each of these dimensions is characterized by an axis shown here in different colors, and this vertical red axis, we have the scientist as the observer, or the scientist as the participant. And so the scientist is playing different roles here versus here. So we'll call this the role axis. That's the ROLE axis, where the scientist is interacting directly or is observing from afar. Okay? All right, then we also have another axis that is now on the diagonal here, and we might call this the control axis, and we can have a true experiment where we are deliberately manipulating at least one independent variable, which would have to have at least two levels, kind of like a short tail length and a typical tail length, okay? Or we can have three levels, but if we have a directly manipulated variable or variables, that would be an experiment. And then over here we have naturalistic observation. And you might imagine that we have a bit of a continuum on each of these, and we can call this the control axis, shown here in blue on the diagonal. Lastly, we can ask where these roles and control levels are taking place, in what setting. And on the horizontal green axis, we have laboratory setting to field setting. Okay, so we can take anything that we might be reading about our research, or any kind of research that you and I might be doing, and we can begin to classify it here. Wonder if I can give you some examples from my own research. As I've mentioned before in class, I am a researcher that studies the visual system, and I do so using computer programs that I write, where I show images on a screen, a computer screen, and I get responses from my participants. I do this on the 5th floor of Knapp Hall. I use a particular kind of Macintosh display, and I run some software called MATLAB. And it's all very, very controlled. I have millisecond timing about my experimental manipulations. I typically have 2 or 3 variables that I'm manipulating directly. Okay? And interestingly, I give instructions about how the participants should complete my experiments. Really inside of my computer program, my computer speaks to the participant. I'm usually not even in the room when the data are being collected. I'm sitting just outside of the room so that I don't influence the participant in any particular way. And the data are collected directly by the computer. So let's take a look at that and see if we can begin to classify my research here on these 3 dimensions. Okay? I would say that I'm pretty far along this side of this axis, true experiment, because I'm usually manipulating 2, sometimes 3 variables. Sometimes they have 3 and 4 levels each, but there very clearly are independent variables that I'm manipulating systematically, trial over trial, in my computer-based experiments. This is going on inside of a laboratory. I have a lot of control over the light levels. I have a lot of control over how large the stimuli are, how long they are shown, and so forth, down to the millisecond. So this is truly a laboratory setting. And very much I'm scientist as observer. I greet my participant when they come in, but then I hit the go button on my computer program, and the computer instructs the participant as to how to proceed, and I'm usually not even in the room. I'm sitting outside. So I'm not directly interacting, and I think that my own presence doesn't matter very much. I'm very much more of an observer in this case. Okay? I'm not interacting directly with my participant. So that's me and my studies, but not all studies are going to be like that. What we'll do now is encourage you to get some practice in classifying the different studies that we might be talking about along these lines, okay, where we have direct observation, indirect observation, and we have these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, we'll put this all in one category, 5 different types of possibilities for classifying studies, and we also have these 3 dimensions for classifying studies. So what I'll ask you to do in a few minutes, don't do it just yet, I'll ask you to turn off the video, and maybe you can copy and paste this particular link on to your web browser and look at a very famous study called the Door Study by Simons and Levin in 1998. It's a short video. It's about 2 minutes long, maybe even a little bit less than that. I think you'll find it very entertaining. I also ask you to take just a brief look at the abstract from that. If you'll copy and paste this into the web browser, you can read the 1-paragraph abstract that'll very much corroborate what you saw in the video. And then I'd like you to do this. As a potential pop quiz question, what type of study was this, and explain why the study is classified that way. And what I'd like you to do is ask yourself, which of these best describes the study that you just saw in the video? Might it be naturalistic observation? Might it be a participant observation, structured observation, field experiment, or some kind of indirect observation where we used either physical traces or archival traces? Which of those best describes this and why? Okay? And that will be one thing that you'll do for this pop quiz question. The other thing that you'll do is you'll take the very same study and see if you can now classify it along these three different dimensions. To what extent is it on this side or that side of the roll axis, this side or that side of the control axis, and this side or that side of the setting axis. Okay? So we've taken a single study, we've classified it along three different dimensions here, and we've classified it along all of these different possible types of direct and indirect observational methods. Okay? This will give us some practice in applying these brand new concepts to some actual experiments. It also connects us directly to the primary literature in the science of psychology. Then we'll ask you to continue doing that, and I'll ask you to think about a study like this. Okay? This is a study that is similar to what Jane Goodall might have done. Here is a photograph of a primate in the wild, and we might ask ourselves the question, even though we don't have an abstract to work with and we don't have a video to work with, what type of study would this be most likely, and explain why it would be. And you can pick again from these options and explain your reasoning as to how you classified this type of study, and then we'll ask you to do the same over here. Okay? So if this were a Jane Goodall-like study, where she's observing behavior in the wild, where would the study land in each of these three dimensions? We'll do one more. We'll talk about a study of the unicycling clown, okay? A study by Hyman, Boss, Wise, McKenzie, and Caggiano, 2011. I'll ask you to copy and paste this so that you can read the abstract. Again, it's just one paragraph is what the abstract is, and what type of study is this, and explain why we classify it this way. We're back to our familiar structure. We'll give you the opportunity to practice on that, and then we'll have you classify that same study along these three dimensions. So we will have taken three different studies and classified it a bunch of ways, and this is a terrific exercise for getting to know what the different opportunities are when we're talking about observational methods, where they might land in a observational method space, and we can think about issues of reactivity and so forth in our class discussions. One more thing that I'll ask you to do before we wrap up is I'm going to ask you to try to complete, before coming into class, your response to one more potential pop quiz question. And this is a concept that lots of students are interested in. You might remember the bystander effect, or the diffusion of responsibility, a phenomenon known in social psychology, and you would have learned about this almost certainly in Psych 100. We'll ask you to copy this into your browser, paste it in, and take a look at what the description is there of the diffusion of responsibility. And then we're going to ask you to design your own new study, and specifically we'll ask you to design a field experiment. Remember what goes into a field experiment. But a field experiment that could investigate the diffusion of responsibility, also known as the bystander effect. So we're asking you now to generate a study of your own on this topic in accordance with what we've said about field experiments. And then when we're in class, I've given you a lot to do, we'll have a lot of interaction between you and the other students. We'll give you chances to share your responses to these potential pop quiz questions, and I look forward to having that conversation with you. So thanks for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in class.